Recording.
It is recording progress. Like those ominous words. Anyway, folks, it's a great delight to welcome you back. This is our first day of a new term. It's also the third anniversary of me starting this post, by the way. Yes, so I started 3 years ago today, and it's been a whirlwind and a very enjoyable 3 years. So, first meeting of the new term. Our theme this term is freedom of religion and belief. And our first speaker is, I think quite apropos for this particular occasion, is Professor Sir Malcolm Evans, who is our new principal of the college. So no sucking up to the new boss, by the way. You know, I mean, I hope that you'll still be robust in your questioning. My name is Anthony Reddie. I'm the director of the centre. It's great to see a number of you who have joined us, who normally do so. I particularly want to make a special, remarks to Professor Paul Finnis, who is with us in person, I think for the first time in a few years, Paul. And Paul, as many of you know, is a distinguished former principal of this college, and we are pleased to have Paul back. So, our theme today is in talking to Professor Malcolm Evans, is really an opportunity for him to reflect on the 25 years in which you have been involved in the work of, religious freedom and its relation to international law. And we will have a conversation and then have time, hopefully at the end, for the usual questions, both for people who are in the room and also for those who are joining us remotely. So kick it off. You studied here in Oxford, both as an undergraduate and as a DPhil scholar here. So how did you get into the area of religious freedom and international law?
Well, not directly as a result of my studying here or my DPhil work here, where, as I think most will know, I studied international law in general, although of course that was one of the routes into this, but my DPhil work was on a completely different area to do with international law of the sea. So it is an interesting question about how it was that having finished a DPhil in international law, but on completely different areas, within a relatively few years' time, I found myself working on religious freedom in relation to international law. And the answer, like most things, is accidental. I can remember with a certain degree of precision, actually, precisely why. And it just also reflects perhaps the benefits, some may say disbenefits, of reading widely outside your area from time to time. Perhaps it was going back to being a student here. There was a sale at the OUP bookshop, and I bought a book, dangerous thing to do, people do it from time to time, and it was called, it was by a guy called Warwick McKean, and it was called something like Equality and Non-Discrimination under International Law. And it was looking at the different ways in which international law was beginning to engage with these issues. And it was written in the late 1980s, I think it was. And the sentence that struck me as I read this, and it still remains with me, was that there was very little on it about religion and religious discrimination, because it was described, quote, as the forgotten discrimination. And it just struck me that a book being written then that was still describing matters to do with religion and discrimination on the grounds of religion and belief as forgotten merited a little bit of thinking as to why. I was just starting my work as an academic in Bristol at the time, and the question came, what about doing some research? And so the thought struck me, well, why not do a little research around this? And so honestly, it was as serendipitous as that. But having commenced that way and got into it, and with the arrogance of the young academic, I decided the best thing to do was to write a book about it. And so having done some reading around the subject and finding that from an international law point of view, in fact, virtually nothing had been written in about certainly the last 15 or 20 years years of the systemic nature of this topic, that indeed it had largely been forgotten. And that was interesting to me. So I set to try to find out why. And in doing so, it took me back and further back and further back. And in the end, with some perhaps with some, what's the word I'm looking for? With some recall of the career that I never had, because I always really wanted to be an ancient historian. I ended up going back to the ancient Mesopotamia, the first law codes, the first inklings of what we would now recognise, though goodness knows they were not recognised as such at the time, of some of the foundational statements that we now understand as being statements of religious freedom, religious toleration, and so on and so forth, rooted in ancient Mesopotamia, and then wrote a book which gave a brief pen portrait of the way that this had developed from very ancient times through the through the changing spectrum of Europe and the public order of Europe in the medieval periods through to the wars of religion and into the 19th century, the public order of Europe, and then particularly how it had fared and begun to creep back into the international law consciousness following the First World War, with the protection of religious minorities through the minorities treaties, and then how it then fared swinging into the modern era of human rights after the Second World War. And so we had a bit of a panorama of all this, ending up with seeing what was then and still now something of a paradox, that with all this long history, by about 1993, the European Court of Human Rights had still not produced a single case on the freedom of religion and belief. It was just beginning when I started the book, and when it was published in 1997, the beginnings of the jurisprudence was emerging. So it was an accidentally leading into a, should we say, a strange academic journey, punctuated by something which I know some in this room will have heard me say before, that one of the most bizarre experiences was writing quite a bit of the text of the book. I'd already been published by Oxford in another field then, so I got in touch with them and said, would you like to publish this? And they read it very seriously. And they came back to me and said no. What was more interesting was the reason why they said no. And I still can't understand this. They said they wouldn't publish it because the topic wasn't interesting. Well, two things flow from that. The idea that 25 years later, anyone would say that the interface of law, international relations, and religion is not interesting is beyond bizarre. And of course, the other slightly more obvious observation is, since when are academic books ever meant to be published on the basis of but there we are. So that tells you a little bit of something about it. But more seriously, the book was published in 1997. And so it is in fact about 25 years since it was written, although closer to 30 since it was originally conceived. And what I will admit I find interesting, because I'm sufficiently conceited to look back at my own publications from time to time, from that book from that time ago, is, and we doubtless will go on to talk about this later, how in some senses so much of the landscape has changed to make it unrecognizable, and yet stripped back underneath that, and certainly from a legal perspective, in an international lawyer's legal perspective, what has changed? In essence, absolutely nothing about what actually matters about this topic.
So could you tell us something about your early experiences as a legal scholar in this field?
Well, I think in a way it mirrors what I've just said about the history of the genesis of my involvement in this field. I suppose I was hugely privileged. And I was hugely privileged in this regard simply by, once again, I suppose, virtue of accident. It is entirely true to say that virtually nobody had written any serious work in the English language as an international lawyer on the field till this book was bravely published by Cambridge in 1997. One other book published by Brill that had come out just a year before. Shortly after, there suddenly seemed to be, if you like, a regular flow of outpouring. I was not the only person around this time who was beginning to wonder why this was such a neglected topic in the scholarship, when it clearly had not been ignored in other places, or what had happened and played out in perhaps, should we say, strange ways. But because I suppose of my publishing the book at that time, there was so little, inevitably it attracted interest. And so when conferences started being put together, when people turned their minds, I suppose, fortuitously for me, it was one of the few resources that existed. It was one of the first systematic explorations of the jurisprudence of the European convention system on human rights at that time. And so I was immediately drawn into that. There's a lot to be said for getting it first. There's also a lot to be said, actually, for being followed by a brilliant scholar who actually did a PhD here in Oxford on it, who happened to be no relation of mine whatsoever, but shared my same surname. Carolyn Evans, and for years and generations, it's entirely obvious that quite a lot of people couldn't work out which Evans was. I'm entirely delighted to have spent quite a time being tailing on the back of Carolyn's excellent scholarship on this field too. But it was quite remarkable for a subject that had so little. The first basic two books coming out of it were both Evans and Evans.
And so in the past 25 years, I mean, what have been the highlights of the particular, I guess, memorable events in that time that you'd like to recall?
Inevitably, these then take us into the way that, you know, because of the work that I'd done as an academic on this, I was being drawn into what I would call the diplomatic and political arena around this. Without doubt, one of the most significant for me moments was being asked to join in the early 2000s the acronyms rule us, don't they? The Advisory Council of the Organisation and Security, I'll get it right in a minute, the OSCE, the Organisation of, it's what it states, the OSCE's Advisory Council on Freedom, thank you, on Security and Cooperation in Europe, their Advisory Council on Freedom of Religion and Belief, which operated out of Warsaw, and the most wholly inappropriately named acronym of all time for a human rights oversight body in Europe, known as the ODIHR, the ODIHR, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And so for getting on for 10 years, I was a member of their advisory council, which was a fantastic group of scholars and other practitioners drawn from across the breadth of Europe and North America, coming together to write guidelines on the recognition of laws of recognition of religious communities, to advise the OSCE on how to respond to emerging controversies, particularly in its heartland fiefdom, you could say, which then was Central and Eastern Europe, particularly because at that time, these were the countries that were joining the Council of Europe following the breakup of the Soviet Union, and these were the countries that were developing new laws relating to freedom of religion and belief, coming out of a very repressive era and trying to translate those, should we say, Soviet bureaucratic approaches to religion into something that resembled more like a freedom-based approach, which international human rights law was pursuing. And so it was a real challenge, but very memorable, meeting with people from within those countries, discussing their draft laws, trying to help shape the legal landscape in that era at that time. And that was another hugely rewarding and a privileged time to be able to be a part of that. And then also, and something that I became particularly proud of, working with that group in writing something that became known as the Toledo Guiding Principles on teaching about education in the public sector. Like many such guidelines, they were adopted and rapidly forgotten at the time, indeed more than rapidly forgotten, somewhat sidelined and blackballed in some quarters because of what they said about the need to create spaces for education about religion and the importance of doing so, and how to do it in a properly respectful way. The good thing is, and this is a lesson to us all, that no matter how failed you may think that sometimes your endeavours and work has been, you never know quite what happens to it. It may come back. And today, those guiding principles have perhaps found their moment and are now widely referred to and are being drawn on in the construction of curricula and informing thinking about how religion should be taught in educational settings. But I suppose for me personally, it led to one of the more surprising, enriching experiences I had a couple of years ago, where rather out of the blue, back in 2016, I was invited to join a 2-year commission run by the Religious Education Council of the UA in the UK for devising and developing proposals to put to government on the future and shaping of religious education in this country. And we came up with something. I think it was good, I think it was valuable, but one of the most enriching things about for me was working along with 15 theologians, religious education teachers and others. I was the only lawyer from a completely different set of backgrounds, and learning from them how this actually worked, should we say, in practice. And that was, again, a very valuable highlight, I would say, of my, let's call it practice related to this area.
Thank you. You and I do have a script here, but actually let me divert from it just a quick second, if you don't mind me. We are a very interdisciplinary group, so we come from a variety of backgrounds, but quite a lot of us are probably formally religious scholars, theologians. I know that's not your area, but it just occurred to me that something that in all of the stuff I read about you, that just occurred to me. To what extent, if at all, because I don't want to presume anything here, that you're a person of faith yourself, that you're a Baptist layperson, how has that fed into your legal work? And how has that fed into your legal work? I mean, to what extent, but put it another way, how different might this work have been if you were not a Baptist?
I can't really answer that question, because if I would, I don't think I would have done it. And so in a way that answers it. It's absolutely foundational. I simply don't think I would have done. If I hadn't have been, at Regent's, if I hadn't have had that exposure to the traditions of Regent's, both in terms of scholarship, but both in theology and study, would I have ever picked up on that line in such a book? No, of course I wouldn't have. And so in a sense, it was absolutely foundational. And of course, it resonates greatly with some of the underlying fundamental precepts of being a Baptist. That of religious toleration, of acceptance of the views of others, whilst of course vigorously putting forward your own, but needing to find that space for respect in the manner in which those are put out, and the importance of respecting the space for all people to enjoy that freedom to worship and to practice in accordance with their own beliefs and traditions. After all, wasn't that something that the very first Baptists were literally crying out for? And in a sense, much of what I've been doing is trying to work through in a different way. Why is it that is still an unfulfilled promise?
Yeah. Thank you. You have this dual identity. You're a legal scholar, but you're also a legal practitioner. So how have you held those two things in tension, and what do you see as some of the maybe opposing forces that might be at play in holding that dual identity together?
Well, I'm a strange sort of practitioner, because although I have very rarely, occasionally, I rarely practice what you would call in what people would assume to be the more formal legal settings. I'm not a courtroom practitioner, I'm I'm not a solicitor advising cases, but I am a practitioner of international law in the sense of working closely alongside governments, foreign offices, international organisations in how they go about generating and applying the law in this area. But the peculiarity of international law is that less so now than historic than some years ago, but largely the practice of international law is still not conducted in courtrooms. It is still not conducted through the more traditional means. It is constructed in those backroom settings of policy formation, generation of shall we say, international agreements, international norms, and diffusion through diplomatic sources. And within that, I am indeed what one would call a practitioner. I suppose the tension which I find within that, and it is, I think, exactly the same tension that many would say who are working in the more traditional legal fora, is the distinction between what you feel you need to do in order to gain a practical outcome in a given situation and what you would actually like to achieve shall we say, from an academic in taking forward a particular argument. After all, and I've seen this in many of the cases litigated in the UK, in England and Wales in recent times as well, where you can see that what people really want is a clear answer to a clear question about what the freedom of religion and belief means. But actually, on the facts of the case, if you're going to do it in the interest of the client, that is not the question to ask, because there are a whole host of, shall we say, other ways perfectly legitimate and appropriate in order to be able to address that question. To give a classic case, for example, many questions which we see are really best understood in terms of what does my freedom of religion and belief mean? Does it mean I can do that? Or does it mean that I can't? Yet to get a practical outcome, actually using different bodies of law, and particularly discrimination or non-discrimination law, may actually be far easier as a means of trying to achieve that outcome. And I have to say there have been some frustrations in some of the more iconic cases which have come up, when you can see that actually, for reasons I understand, those presenting the cases have, if you like, gone for the principal point about freedom of religion, which they almost invariably lose. When from a client's perspective, had they pursued some of these other routes, grounding it in claims of indirect discrimination, for example, they would more likely have won, but what does winning mean in that context? And I think that then becomes the difficult issue for many who, if you like, straddle both the academic and the practitioner, as I've described it, feel is, what is winning? Is it gaining the outcome for the person or on the issue that you are looking at, which is often, shall we say, an exercise in pragmatism, this is what we need here, or is it actually trying to establish, if you like, the answer to that bigger meta point that you would like to have clarified, but so often than not is so difficult actually to address through the medium of litigation, let alone practical diplomacy in relation to a given incident.
Thank you. So what have been the biggest changes then across the last 25 years?
Well, I did say that at the outset that the field had changed dramatically across those 25 years, more or less, since the publication of the book. It is a truism in international affairs. On the one hand, everything is on top of everything, but international law is a leisurely discipline, so it's normally running several years behind pitch, like so many other things. One of the ways in which the landscape has changed out of all recognition, in one sense, is certainly within the jurisprudence of international jurisprudence relating to freedom of religion and belief, which still is largely the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. There has been very little generated out of the other regional human rights system, which isn't to say nothing, but not a lot that really has been, shall we say, foundational, and increasingly with the growing and welcome fashion for what's called judicial dialogue between different bodies, there is more and more alliance on that which is coming out of Europe, outside of Europe, than perhaps previously, simply because the density of the jurisprudence, which is now after the last 25 years or so, actually evolved. But if you looked at the beginning of that jurisprudence, it was very much couched in terms of what we would call classic human rights style cases. What do I mean by that? Where I, as an individual, are challenging you as the as the state for the way in which you may have trampled on my freedom. The famous Kokinakis case in Greece, where a Jehovah's Witness had been arrested for under the Greek offence at the time of improper proselytism, and so had this crossed the bounds of legitimacy when he was convicted for this. Was it a free violation of his freedom of religion and belief, basically to be criminalised for attempting to proselytise and convert? And similarly, other cases with the concerning the interface with the freedom of expression, what one can say without when causing offence to religious believers. At what point does that cross a line and allow it to be prosecuted as a criminal or a civil offence, etc. So, but these are what you would call classic clashes of rights type positions. And then, going back to what we were saying earlier, with the way that we had the opening up of Europe during the late 1990s in particular, the realization that new questions were being asked. And it wasn't so much the way that it wasn't so much what the state was doing to trench upon my rights as the individual, but the question then became, well, how should the state become the overseer of the religious life of the country? Because these were countries that had different traditions in relation to the role of the state vis-a-vis organisational aspects of life, in a way that even we with established churches, it's not the same. And so the question is, well, how should they do it, particularly around the question of the formal recognition, registration of religions, religious life? What were the conditions that could legitimately be posed upon the practice of religion? And so that then all led to a different type of debate about what the freedom of religion actually meant. And it should say, moved the state from the role of the potential violator of the right, putting it centre stage as if like the organiser of the right, which in relation to human rights is a bit unusual. It's not quite what you expect. And that then generated a whole level of different problems. And as a result, the answer, perhaps it was inevitable, that fell out of that was that, rather than human rights being, if you like, being about the arbiter of the clash of rights, it became about the architecture of the protection of the freedom of religion and belief. And the language that was put in then became the language of neutrality, which seems what's wrong with saying that the state should be neutral in these matters. But neutrality here has come to mean very different things over time. Initially, neutrality could be, and indeed by some was, more or less interpreted as withdrawal. We've got to be neutral here. We make sure there's a level playing field, but what happens on it is nothing to do with us. We just let religious people involved in their own contestation. We're neutral here. Neutrality almost, if you like, as disinterest. Neutrality then changed to say, well, that was all very well when the state wasn't expected to have much of a role in relation to religion. But the moment that you then get the idea of the state having to be a regulator or do it, disinterest was no longer an option. And so then it became, well, they have to be neutral and impartial in the way they exercise their regulatory powers, which is slightly different, but you could say quite acceptable. It's within the line, within the ambit of the ideas of toleration, that you tolerate all and you don't show preference in how you go about engaging with people because of their beliefs. Seems unexceptional, but that then spilled over the language of neutrality very easily into the language of the state being neutral. It's a huge difference to say the state should act neutrally impartially to people and to say that the state should be neutral in relation to matters of religion. Yet it seems so simple, an elision. Yet that was the elision that happened. And it then led, of course, to that space in which we've been able to have all these different problematic cases concerning restrictions on headscarves, religious clothing, the presence of religion or religious symbols in the public sphere, with the idea that the only way the state can be seen to be neutral is basically to expunge religion from the public space, because otherwise it is to endorse. I've never quite understood that line of thinking, I have to say, simply because I've got this is not a designer jacket, but if you're in a designer jacket with a label on it, okay, you're wearing what they put, but are you endorsing the manufacturer in the sense of prioritizing them over any others? No, I could go home and I might have another with a different label on it. It doesn't mean that the state is endorsing because it allows them to be present in the public space. I've never understood why, for example, in some countries, as is the case, if a lady is wearing a headscarf, it cannot be allowed in the delivery of a public service because it implies that the state is endorsing their religious beliefs. But that is the argument. And of course, for some it does. And perhaps respect and toleration means that you have to respect and understand that and understanding itself. But it meant that you led to a completely different type of debate within the jurisprudence. But then, of course, we have the other big switch flowing from 9/11 and the Twin Towers attack with the securitization agendas, which then changed the entire landscape of freedom of religion and belief fundamentally yet again. And so rather than the state then viewing its role in relation to religion as, shall we say, to be neutral in a rather absolutist sense, it certainly wanted to do completely the opposite, which is to be very non-neutral in relation to those which it was favouring and those which it was not, based on which it felt were posing, securitized threats to the, to the state. And so it became neutrality almost as exclusion in that sense, where you showed your neutrality as a state by excluding people from the public space and the state. And that then has now produced many of the problems that I think we have today. And I think in particular, where policymakers have got this completely wrong, they seem to think that if you securitize religion as a result, just say, well, we're just pushing religion to the margins, that would not be problematic. Partly because I don't think so many policymakers who have become themselves probably a little too divorced from an understanding of the importance of religion in the life of believers quite ever understood the nature and importance of religion and belief and the different natures of that for some believers. But I think certainly in the West, in this country and elsewhere, they thought that if they did, well, who was going to complain? Because Christians wouldn't. Because they don't mind that sort of thing. They're used to Christianity being shunted off the stage, and if the best thing now to do with religion is just to put it back in its box, well, no one's going to complain about it. And those who complain are the ones we just want to get rid of, and everyone else is going to put up with it. And it turned out no. And that was another big change across those 25 years. Whereas when I was starting my work, that would be the case. Now, where this has been happening over the past few years, others, and Christians in particular, have shown that they do care. And that it does matter if they are being pushed off the, if you like, the public playing field along with everybody else. Everybody wants to have that voice, a Christian backlash, if you like. But of course, that has presented itself in some ways in an equally problematic way, in my view, which is focusing on Christian persecution. And the idea that what we ought to be doing is focusing on this to the exclusion of the rights of others. It's just setting itself up as another absolutism, which is why some of us have spent a lot of time to say this is not the way we ought to be going. It's just returning us to some unhelpful debates in the past, where what we were really doing is simply trying to argue, whose discrimination is worse than my discrimination. We saw this going back to my original work with the OSCE in particular, where there was excellent work put in place around anti-Semitism, And then there was saying, well, we have to have work around Islamophobia. And then people said, well, we need work about Christianophobia. And then, frankly, unless you could establish yourself as being the victim of a phobia, you had no airspace. And it just became a zero-sum game with everyone trying to prove that they were the most disadvantaged group, rather than trying to focus on what was the other side, and I would say the more positive side of the coin here, which is how to ensure that all peoples can enjoy their legitimate freedoms. And that was the bit that was getting lost. So that, in a way, is a bit of a pen portrait of how within the jurisprudence things have changed, and some of the reasons for that over time.
Thank you. So as we sort of come towards the end of that initial conversation, there'll be ample time for questions, both in the room and for those who are joining us remote. Also, what do you perceive as now being the future challenges?
Well, to me, I think the future challenges are the challenges that should have been met at the outset. You know, what we need is a proper understanding of what the freedom of religion and belief actually means, because frankly, we don't. And there are certain good reasons for this. It's quite ironic that the freedom of religion and belief, even by Roosevelt, was set out as one of the 4 foundational freedoms. And yet, has it been developed? No. It was in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the idea of the freedom of religion, the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and the standard wording defined in the European Convention has been repeated in others. But really, since the 1970s, the only game in town has been watering down the wording of that commitment. You have the United Nations Declaration on Discrimination on Grounds of Religion and Belief that doesn't even clearly endorse the right of people to change their religious beliefs. It simply talks in terms of them being able to have their beliefs. Not even change. Now, everyone says that that's, of course, people have got the right to change their religious beliefs under international law. Not everyone agrees. It is still, it is incredible that at this point there can still be people who will argue that international law does not provide people with the right actually to change the religion into which they were born on the basis of their own own beliefs. But such is the case. The point is that we got an early politicization around the freedom of religion and belief. Going into the Cold War, the freedom of religion and belief was seen as, to use crude language, something that could be used by the West to batter the atheist Soviet Union, just as social, economic and cultural rights, and particularly discrimination and racial discrimination, was seen as something that could be used to point the finger at the failings of Western countries. And so the two things basically became a standoff, or a standoff to a point. It was agreed that there would be international action on both. The International Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination was duly adopted in the early 1960s. There was meant to be a matching convention on the elimination of all forms of religious discrimination, which has never happened. Work on that, as many in this room know, was stalled in the mid-1960s and has never been returned to ever since. And all the other processes have been more about trying to preserve the status quo, or the watered down status quo, because it is seen as being politically damaging and divisive. Religion, once again, being utilized by political factions in other places, instrumentalized for their own purposes, just as it was after 9/11. Throughout that period, when I was with the OSCE and beyond, we had what became known as the defamation of religions debate. And that was precisely that. Just as at the time, you were having, on the one hand, arguments about human rights and freedom of religion, meaning that there needed to be an opening up and liberalization of the restrictive laws in many Islamic countries. The Islamic countries themselves answering back that we have the concept of defamation, religion should not be subject to defamation, and so respect and tolerance meant that it was perfectly possible to clamp down on those who were speaking ill of their religion and belief, and so on. So again, rather than a shield, it becomes a sword. That debate, after about 8 or 9, 10 years in the United Nations of increasingly frantic resolution, counter-resolution, everyone ran out of steam, and finally, do what you always do, produced a resolution which puts it to bed. I always thought it was quite ironic that the UN numbering of that was Resolution 1618, which anyone with a historical eye will know what happened in 1618 as regards the launching of wars of religion. But it put that debate to bed, and so now you get UN processes which were largely, should we say, soft around the edges, trying to basically, I hate to say this, platitudinous policy platforms, coordination platforms, but are they actually getting to the core of what the violations are, what the right means, and how it should be protected? No, because the answer, once again, it is too politically contentious, it is instrumentalized too much politically when you attempt to do that, so the safe thing to do is not to do it at all. And we saw that, I told you earlier, a little like in the jurisprudence. It's only mirroring what's happening in that broader scheme. And for as long as that happens, we keep the issue on the table, but off the boil. And that basically is what the international approach is. And we all know what that means in practice. It creates plenty of spaces for real violations to take place, real damage to be done, and ultimately not a lot to be done about it. So the real challenge is what it's always been. Throughout all this period, understanding what the freedom of religion and belief for all actually means in practice, what it looks like, because frankly, we don't really know. And after all these years, isn't that a bit surprising?
Well, yes.
I would have thought so.
Yeah. Last question, which is maybe it's a self-indulgence of myself. It's something I frequently shall post to myself. So clearly at this juncture you are a senior academic professor, an esteemed person across the world, principal of an Oxford college. What would your younger self say to your older self? And vice versa?
Well, I know. Gosh. Didn't see that one coming.
Save the best till last.
Yeah. I'm sure the older one would have said, well, I'm not sure what the older one would have said to the younger one. I suspect the older one might have said to the younger one, why don't you try to get your head around these sort of things a little bit better while it's still flexible enough to be able to do it. Or they might have said, these problems are so intractable, why don't you just go away and enjoy this thing? What would the younger one say to the older one? I would try to remind myself of that crazed confidence that I had when I rather crazily read a line in a book and just thought, do you know what, that's really interesting. Why don't I go off and try to see what that's about and see if we can do anything about it? Because I think, it was, it's so hackneyed, but it's true. You see these things and at some point you actually feel, yeah, I can devote time to that, that's worth doing. And it didn't feel crowded out by all the other things that were around you. There was a little bit of a spark that fired. And I think the trouble is, as you get older, you still see the sparks, but they don't fire you in the same way. You just got ground down by everything else. And so I think the younger one would be saying to me, no, there is still something to be done about this. You've talked about it, you've analysed it, you've deconstructed it, you've reconstructed it, now why don't you do something about it? So I think that's what the younger one would is, and it's good to feel young at times because there's a lot to be done.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.